You're listening to the Greeks Gridiron. Now here's your host, Ethan Hristodoulou.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Greeks Gridiron. I am Ethan Hristodoulou, and today it's March 14th, 2025, on a beautiful Friday. Today, we are diving into winners and losers of NFL's free agency period. Yes, we are on day 3 of the official beginning of free agency. Obviously, we had a couple of days of tampering to kick off the week before Wednesday at 4 p.m. struck, but a lot of players have moved around. We've seen teams get better. We've seen teams get worse. So now, obviously, way too early, but as everyone loves to do, we're talking winners, we're talking losers, who made out and who lost because of all the player movement we've seen around the league. I invite you all to comment down below. I want to hear from you all. How did your team do? How did your rival teams do? How are you feeling about your favorite team coming out of this free agency period? And do you, of course, agree or disagree with what I have to say? I would love to discuss with you all, but we'll start with the first person that I would like to announce as a winner, because I've got to say, after a season that impressed everybody, I would say surprised everybody, we've got to discuss Sam Darnold being the first big winner of this free agency period, signing a 3-year, $100.5 million deal with $55 million in guarantees with the Seattle Seahawks. For Sam Darnold, no matter what happens from this point on, and he's already made a fair amount of money, don't get me wrong. It's not like Sam Darnold isn't already well off. He was a number 3 overall selection way back when he first got drafted. But that being said, $55 million in guarantees when you sign your name on a piece of paper after what has been a pretty rocky road to his career, where it looked like it wasn't going to amount to much when he was coming out of New York and then ultimately bouncing around between Carolina and then San Francisco. With the season he had last year, he cashed in big time. No matter what happens going forward, Sam Darnold is a winner. Maybe not so much on the field, depending on what happens from this point on, but at the very least, he can laugh his way to the bank account and feel pretty good about that. That being said, though, this is one of those catch-22s in my eyes, and while I look at Sam Darnold and I think, yes, he is a winner, there are some things about this that I don't necessarily like, and it almost, in my eyes, makes it like Sam Darnold is a winner, but the Seattle Seahawks are kind of like a pseudo-loser in this situation here, and it's partially to do with Sam Darnold, but also partially to do with just the situation that is going on in Seattle right now, and that being that the Seahawks, over the last 3 years while Geno Smith was their quarterback, and even prior to that as well when Russell Wilson was still here, have struggled to protect the quarterback. And for as great as last season was for Sam Darnold, we saw in those final 2 weeks of the season just what can happen to Sam Darnold when the lights get turned on a little too bright and the pressure from the defense gets on a little too strong. And when you look at Seattle, tied for 3rd most sacks last season allowed, I am a little bit concerned about what this is actually going to look like if the offensive line does not improve going into next year. That has got to be priority number 1 as far as anything else goes between now and that very first game of the season next year for Seattle. I would argue that if DK Metcalf was still here, or in Seattle, I should say, I'd maybe feel a little bit better about this whole situation. However, he is not here, and that honestly, if your plan was to bring in Sam Darnold, and I understand, paying $33 million is a lot for a wide receiver, don't get me wrong. And yes, you have Jackson Smith and Jigba. I get that. But I would feel a lot better about this situation knowing that at the very least, the offensive line, by no means perfect in Seattle as it currently stands. You at least have 2 legitimate, bona fide studs on both sides of the field when you're on offense in DK Metcalf, in JSN, that Sam Darnold will be able to play that point guard position and just dish out the ball to the playmakers and let things happen with the ball in their hands. Now that it's just JSN, if he's getting double covered, he's struggling to find a way to get open, and the offensive line is not up to snuff, this could go sideways, and it could wind up being a $100 million mistake on Seattle's end. So while I look at Sam Darnold as a big winner in this situation here, I do look at Seattle as a bit of a loser in this one. And I hate to say that, but that's just kind of the way I'm feeling right now. A lot needs to be improved upon between now and that very first week of the NFL season for 2025 before I actually feel really good about this signing. I'm excited to see what happens, don't get me wrong, and my hope is that Seattle does fix the O-line and the issues we've seen from Seattle's ability to protect the quarterback over the last 3, 4, 5 years now, it feels like, gets improved upon, but it is something that is just weighing on me in the back of my mind. Next up on the list is going to be our first loser, and I hate this one because I'm a big fan of his game, but all the way down in Houston, up-and-coming stud of a quarterback, CJ Stroud. I do have a little bit of concern with what we are seeing from the Houston Texans. And in the same vein, as far as my concerns surrounding Seattle, I would like to see a clearer picture as to what is going on with the offensive line over there in Houston. Now, this is a very interesting situation, and the reason I say it's an interesting situation is because last offseason, I was going through teams, talking about things that I would like to see teams improve going through the offseason. It was like right out of the gates as soon as the offseason struck following the Super Bowl. One thing I harped on was the need for the Houston Texans to improve the offensive line a bit. I got absolutely annihilated and blasted by Texans fans telling me I didn't know what I was talking about, guys were hurt and just missed a ton of time, and that the offensive line was going to be a top-end unit and far better than what they were the year prior coming out of that last season. Now, obviously, we look at the way things playing out in 2024. That is not the case. And now we're seeing basically a fire sale on the offensive line in Houston. Laramie Tunsil traded to the Commanders. Kenyon Green traded to the Eagles. Shaq Mason designated as a post-June 1st release. Now, they did go ahead and bring in Laken Tomlinson to mitigate some of the offensive line changes we're seeing here, but this is definitely something that I am very much concerned about. CJ Stroud at this current point in his career, since he got into the league, is the second most sacked quarterback in these last 2 seasons at 90 sacks. He's only one behind the number one guy, and that is Bryce Young over the last 2 seasons, sitting at 91. So there is definitely concern to be had surrounding the offensive line. My obvious assumption is going to be that the Houston Texans are going to work on re-establishing what this offensive line needs to be. They need to be more aggressive, a little bit more nasty, and that seems to be something that DeMeco Ryans has harped on himself. So maybe that is the plan going forward. And looking into the Laramie Tunsil trade, trying to make sense of it, because in my eyes, and I know a lot of other people would probably agree, one of the best pass protectors on the blind side in the NFL. So that was an interesting move to make, but it seems like people, whether it's fans or even, I guess, analysts, whatever you want to call them, just the people that I've read about or read from, it seems like there were some just overall fit and culture concerns surrounding Tunsil, and maybe that could have ultimately led to the reason why he was traded. Was the compensation good enough for the move? I would say so. I don't really think that the Texans didn't make off pretty well with that move there, all things considered, with what they gave up to acquire him early on. Was it from the Miami Dolphins whenever that trade first happened? But I will say this. Between now, the draft, training camp, start of the NFL season, all eyes are going to be on what that offensive line looks like between now and then. You basically let go of 3 guys that ate up significant snaps and time spent on that offensive line over the last X amount of years. I genuinely hope that there is a really good plan in place here, because I would say and argue that a big reason why Houston ends up falling flat come season end this past year, pass protection. It really comes simply down to that. Yes, there were some other injuries on the offense as well, especially to the wide receiver room, that was really hurting what they were able to do offensively. But CJ Stroud, you look at those numbers, you look at the amount of times he got sacked last year, it was pretty insane the amount of times that he was being brought down for at least 4 or more sacks in a game. I know he was sacked for at least, I think, 8 sacks once, maybe even twice. So in a couple of games last season. So protecting CJ Stroud at all costs has got to be priority number one going through the remainder of this offseason. 2 very similar things for a winner and loser so far, but CJ Stroud, as it currently stands, that offensive line needs to change a lot before I feel a lot better about what Houston has going on offensively into next season. The next winner on the list here, Minnesota and the Vikings. Despite losing their starting quarterback and also having some key guys potentially hitting the open market here, I want to say this. I am very much excited about what we are going to see from this Vikings team. Now, quarterback obviously remains a big question mark in whether they land Aaron Rodgers or they're just going to go all in and run with J.J. McCarthy remains to be seen. We'll get there. We'll have the answer on that. But it's everything else that they were able to do to fortify and just keep this team together and, in my eyes, improve is what I really love about this offseason so far from Minnesota. They've spent some money, kept some guys, but also brought in key players. Javon Hargrave and Jonathan Allen, both proven commodities. Two guys up front that should make immediate impacts in what is an aggressive unit over there in Minnesota that has no issues coming after a quarterback and making them feel uncomfortable. I believe finishing with, if it's not the highest, it was like the second highest blitz rate in the NFL, but I think it was number one if I'm remembering correctly. When you look at these two guys, Hargrave and Jonathan Allen, you only had to pay them a combined $32 million of AAV altogether to get both these guys on your roster, which is a steal in my eyes, because if you take out 2024, both of them missing some decent amount of time going through the 2024 season, but if you look at their track record for the 3 years prior to that, so from 2021 to 2023, some really productive seasons, you're basically looking at just about 50 sacks combined between these two guys. If you want to talk about fits for what this defense does over there in Minnesota, Jonathan Hargrave, Jonathan Allen, two bona fide studs on the interior of defenses. I know things started to not work out too well for Jonathan Allen in Washington, and that's why he was available. And Javon Hargrave maybe was not quite as productive after leaving Philadelphia. Pairing these two together, along with the scheme that Brian Flores has cooking up over there in Minnesota, is something I can definitely get behind and something I'm really excited to see. The other thing that I'm a huge fan of was the ability to retain Byron Murphy. This was one that I honestly thought was like a as good as gone type deal for Minnesota just because of how much money it was probably going to cost to keep him. Byron Murphy was unbelievable last year, leading the NFL in interceptions. And on top of that, not only were you able to keep Byron Murphy, but you were able to go out and get yourself Isaiah Rodgers as well. Now, I am very loosely these days a Colts fan. Very loosely. I grew up rooting for them. My fandom is not what it used to be, but I still follow Indianapolis. I still know what's going on with them. Isaiah Rodgers, one of my favorite guys from that team just a few years ago, was devastated about the gambling thing, his release, ultimately moving on, going to Philadelphia. Isaiah Rodgers is a stud. I'm a big fan of his game. I'm a big fan of his ability. He was a guy that not a lot of people knew of while he was in Indianapolis, really earned his keep there before ultimately the gambling thing happened and he missed an entire year due to suspension. But that's a guy who earned his keep and earned his playing time, tooth and nail. Now, coming into what they're doing in Minnesota, playing alongside guys like a Byron Murphy, and yes, you did lose some guys on in the secondary of your defense. Cameron Bynum, obviously, now in Indianapolis, funny enough. This is a secondary where you got to keep a Byron Murphy, bring in a guy like Isaiah Rodgers, a unit you do not want to mess with. And then you have yourself the offensive line improvements that they went and made. The Will Fries one is the really interesting one. Ryan Kelly, I look at him as just like he is a very solid answer at the center spot. But for Will Fries, this will be the one that I'm really keeping an eye on. But I do ultimately like the signing so long as he comes back from his injury and does not show any, I guess, just like negative side effects due to how pretty ugly injury, I would say, especially for a big man. So keep an eye on him because this is a ton of money for somebody. And I believe the longest contract that was given out so far, 5-year deal. I think he was the only 5-year deal handed out through all of free agency. At least the last time I checked. Maybe somebody else has gotten a 5-year deal since then, but I don't think so. So big contract for him. He's a guy that I really liked. Another one of those players that was not like drafted highly, not highly touted, but earned his keep and earned his playing time in Indianapolis' offensive line, and ultimately just a devastating injury wipes out basically all of last year for him. But he is one that if he can get back to form and he's looking good and isn't affected by that injury in any type of way, Minnesota has gotten some really big pickups this offseason, and I really like where they're going. It sucks that the biggest question mark is at the most important position right now, whether it's J.J. McCarthy, whether it's a flyer on Aaron Rodgers, because as of this recording, he has not decided where he's going yet. We'll see, but I'm very much excited to see what Minnesota looks like going into next year, because this is a team that I think did a really good job of retooling, resetting, and I would be shocked if they're not right back in the thick of things next year, fighting through that NFC playoff picture. Now, this next one's kind of an obvious one, and I felt like I almost didn't want to bring it up just because of how obvious it is, but part of me also feels because it's so obvious, it would be wrong to ignore it. So, San Francisco, you are our next big loser here. Now, here's the deal with this one. The amount of players that are now gone from the 49ers that were on that team last season, or even just the last few seasons, I should say, that contributed so much in terms of why that team was the way it was, with them consistently being well within the NFC playoff picture, making it to Super Bowls, making it to NFC championship games. There comes a point where, yes, I look at San Francisco and I consider them one of those teams that are one of the best at like retooling, resetting, and running it back, essentially. There is a tipping point eventually, and this kind of feels like this might be the offseason for that tipping point. You're looking at Charvarius Ward, Talanoa Hufanga, Javon Hargrave, Dre Greenlaw, Aaron Banks, Leonard Floyd, Deebo Samuel was obviously traded, Malik Collins, and a few other guys. But those are like the big heavy hitters that you are watching depart this offseason, whether it was through free agency or the Deebo Samuel trade. And there's even still rumors, and while I'm not super sold on them and I don't really think it happens, there's conversation that maybe even Brandon Ayuk ends up being gone. That is a lot of starting caliber players who would start on a handful of teams in other places, and they were all basically signed to be starters where they are now. But even if they don't wind up being a starter on the team that they're on, which I'd be shocked, all of these guys are starting caliber players that you now have to fill. That alone is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 guys who could basically fill a starting role. Malik Collins, maybe a more rotational guy, but somebody who had 5 sacks for the team last year. I don't know how you retool enough to not make all of that hurt too much. Now, again, I look at San Francisco as one of those teams that does a really good job, especially in the front office, of going and finding guys, especially in the draft, being able to, maybe bring them a little bit higher than what their ceiling was anticipated in being, and maximizing their talent. But there comes a point where you are just losing too much in a singular offseason for it to not hurt, and that's kind of where I'm at with San Francisco right now. I don't really look at last year as like an indictment of the team was starting to fall off there. Injuries really got to them last season, and it was clear very early on and I got a lot of flack for this. I had San Fran as like a middle of the pack team, I want to say like 4 weeks into the season, and I got a lot of flack for that early on, but I held steady on that, and they basically wound up being just below middle of the pack. But injuries really got to them last year. This is where I look at them now and I go, okay, this is a team that's really, really staring down the possibility of maybe taking a step back. And even if everyone stays healthy, is more so a 6, 7, 8, 9 win team than they are a 10, 11, 12 win team type of deal. I could be totally wrong, but that's just kind of the situation you're in. You're staring down the barrel right now of a big extension for Brock Purdy as well. Whether or not that winds up being an issue or not remains to be seen, because I'm sure for a guy like Brock Purdy, who, yes, Mr. Irrelevant in the draft, helped guide this team to a Super Bowl appearance, NFC championship games, and has had some unfortunate injuries along the way, compensation seems like it might end up being a bit of a pressure point between both sides for those negotiations. We'll see what happens there. But the other thing that I'm kind of concerned about right now, and this might not seem like a big deal to some people, but I do think that there is some weight to be put on with this. The 49ers going out and getting Mac Jones is an interesting wrinkle to watch. It could be completely nothing. And maybe I'm making, mountains out of molehills right now. But Mac Jones was apparently, per reports, a target of Kyle Shanahan's. He really liked the idea of having a guy like Mac Jones who, coming out of the draft, a lot of people praised for, maybe not being super physically gifted, but he had the brains to be able to understand a complicated offense. And Mac Jones's career to this point has been an interesting one. The situations that he was put in New England at times, in my eyes, not really fair, but I think we know at this point what Mac Jones is as a quarterback now that he had a year away from the New England Patriots when he was in Jacksonville, relieving Trevor Lawrence while he was dealing with his injuries this year. But my biggest concern is just like the drama, not within the team, but what could come from the media circus surrounding it. Because no matter how much anyone likes to say, we're tuning out the noise, in 2025, in this day and age, the media is as loud as it's ever been, and they will create narratives and create problems that do not exist, that at some point you will hear so many times, no matter how much you try to block out the noise, that will create some sort of conundrum. The simple resolution is Purdy gets his extension this offseason, and that conversation is dead. But if somehow, some way, we don't see an extension between Purdy and the 49ers, and we go through this season, and that does not happen, and Mac Jones is sitting on that roster, and this will be a big season for Purdy, where you're watching guys like Deebo Samuel be taken away. The defense, there's no way the defense is going to match what it was a couple of seasons ago with the amount of losses it's taken on that side of the football. So the way I see it, if that defense isn't able to carry quite as much as it has in years past, you're now missing a guy like Deebo Samuel, who was a key cog to that offense for a good portion of the time that Purdy has been there. If things start to go sideways, Purdy never got his extension this offseason, all hypotheticals here, and then Mac Jones finds his way into starting a football game, or the noise just starts to build. Maybe we try Mac Jones. It's not looking good with Purdy. He's struggling. We've had some games from Purdy last year that did not look great. Multiple interceptions thrown in a couple of different games where things did not look good while a lot of those key pieces were out missing time. There is a potential storm that could brew, and I know the media is going to love to push it. I'm just a little bit wary. That's all I'm saying. Reality is, ton of guys lost. This is going to be a tough team to come back from all of this, just with how much turnover you have in money that you have tied up in potential future extensions right now. Just keep an eye on San Francisco. I'm not writing them off completely, but this will be a tough hill to climb coming out of this offseason. The next winner on the list that we have here, this is a very exciting one. Patriots fans, your team has spent some money, and I think it goes without saying that you are a winner coming out of this offseason. Regardless of what happens from this point on, you are a winner in this offseason. There was so much conversation in the lead up to free agency about the Patriots and Robert Kraft's willingness and or unwillingness to potentially spend the money necessary to try and help flip this roster in a singular offseason. There was the sentiment that Robert Kraft maybe felt burned after the 2021 spending that this team did to try to retool the team and build around Mac Jones while he was the quarterback there and Bill Belichick was still in the building. I do think now we are clear as day, pretty obvious, seeing that the Patriots, Kraft, and company are all 1,000% behind whatever it is Mike Vrabel wants to do to try and build a contender here. You look at the money spent, a whopping $284.25 million handed out through contracts with $163.4 million in guarantees. This was the message that the Patriots fans, in my eyes, so desperately needed from their ownership. Not the team, not Elliott Wolf, not Mike Vrabel, but from Robert Kraft and the rest of the Kraft group themselves. Fans needed this. They needed to know that their team was not only going to try to rebuild and build around, of course, a promising young quarterback in Drake May and, of course, their new head coach in Vrabel, but they were going to be aggressive and try to make this turnaround happen sooner rather than later. It could have been very easy to come out, sign a big name or two, and then just depth. No, they're trying to do the Commanders route. They're trying to flip in a singular offseason, and I respect the hell out of that aggressiveness. Because when you look at where the Patriots were this past season, and I remember going into last season as well, and this was not something that I think was really talked about enough, and it's something that's been a lot clearer even to myself going through this offseason. The Patriots nearly had about half the allotted amount of cap space available to them all through last season. And for anyone to have believed that last year was going to be better than that 4-win season that they had is silly in hindsight. And I'm somebody that thought maybe the Patriots could win like 6-7 games, like realistically, but even that was obviously silly in hindsight. They did not spend the money. They were not paying the players that needed to be paid to have a roster and a coaching staff, of course, conducive enough of winning enough football games like that. But this offseason is a complete 180 and a much needed one at that. 7 of the signings on the defensive side of the ball to rebuild a unit that severely underperformed last season, and one that should look far better going into this year. And I mean, you look at the signings that we have and the history and tie-ins that they have with the coaching staff now. You look at like Harold Landry and Carlton Davis, guys that have tie-ins to Mike Vrabel and Terrell Williams. And then you have like Robert Spillane and Mac Hollins, tie-ins to Mike Vrabel and Josh McDaniels. Like, they're bringing in guys that have history with the systems that are being put into place and are familiar. These are the guys that are going to be those leaders in that locker room that this team so desperately needed during the 2024 season here. I love the emphasis on familiarity with the players that they've brought in, them going out and spending big on Milton Williams. That's one of those things that I'm glad to see that they went after somebody that was amongst a lot of people like a consensus top free agent within this free agency class. I am a little bit hesitant about paying someone who over the last 2 seasons only has 17 starts total. But that's one of those, like, we're projecting now with a full-time role, full opportunity, playing alongside guys that they're bringing in and already have on the roster. They're anticipating far more production out of him. I get what they're doing there. I am a little bit hesitant on that, but I'm by no means just out on the signing altogether. It's just one of those things that it's like I'm a little more skeptical than maybe some other people are, and I just kind of like need to see it to believe it type of deal. But I get where the idea is, and I get where they're coming from with that, but I'm here for it. I do think the wide receiver room still needs addressing. As of right now, as of this recording, Cooper Kupp is not a Patriot. It sounds like they're in on him, but it sounds like he wants a lot of money to go play for teams that he's maybe not as keen on joining. So the rumored number is like upwards of $15 million or more a season to some of those teams that he's maybe not so interested in playing for, where he'll maybe take a little less if it's like a West Coast team or a playoff contender or something like that. So Patriots are going to have to shovel out the money if they want a guy like that. It makes sense to me. I mean, there's no guarantee that anything that they've done this offseason improves the team. Obviously, you could assume it's going to, but there's no guarantee. This is a 4-win team that's working through an offseason trying to convince players that things are different now. So this offseason goes a long way in doing that for fans, for prospective players that would maybe want to join this offseason or maybe down the road. Robert Kraft showed everybody that he is more than willing to open up that checkbook and fortify a roster that was so devoid of talent last year, and it's really exciting to see where this Patriots team is heading. And I'm not even a Patriots fan. I just work in Patriots media, but it's exciting to see that. A loser. Going to go back to the negative side of things here. This is the last loser we have on the list, though. My goal for this was to be, I don't want to say more positive than not, but I don't like to harp on negativity too much. And this is something we already kind of discussed a bit, but the Cincinnati Bengals, we've got to talk about this. And I did talk about this on Monday, but we got to harp on it a little bit more because now that we've seen the tampering period go by and free agency officially open up, the Bengals are losing this offseason, and there's no real other way to put it. And Bengals fans, I don't hate Cincinnati. I don't want anyone to think I'm hating on Cincinnati or that I have some ill will towards Cincinnati. I'm not some closet Steeler fan. I'm not a closet Ravens fan or something like that. I grew up rooting for the Colts. I have zero issue whatsoever with them. I have zero issue with even the teams within the division of the AFC South. My fan allegiance is to the league as a whole and to the sport of football first before anything else. I have never watched a front office fumble an offseason and sit on their hands with such decisiveness, it feels, more than I have seen Cincinnati these past few seasons. And it's crazy because there was a point in time where it felt like Cincinnati was really putting it together and was figuring things out. They were in a Super Bowl just a few years ago, like, honest to God. So it's like the last couple of seasons, it feels like I've just been watching the Bengals stick their foot in their mouth again and again and again. From offering to sign Chase to an extension last offseason and then that not happening, and Jamar Chase having to come out because people are asking, oh, you know, like, is it him? Is he causing the problem? Is he being a diva? But he was like, I didn't even want the extension. They told me they were going to extend me, and then they didn't. So that whole holdout last year, Cincinnati's fault. Whether it's ownership, the front office, I don't know, but somebody over on that side deserves the blame. Then you have Duke Tobin at the Combine promising to make Jamar Chase the highest paid non-quarterback in the NFL. Since he's made those comments, we watched Max Crosby break that number, and then we watched Myles Garrett not only break that number, but leapfrog it by about $5 million a year. The bar is now $40 million a season, AAV, if you want to sign Jamar Chase as the highest non-paid quarterback in the NFL. The bar was here. It went to here, and then courtesy of Myles Garrett, it went to here. What are we waiting for in Cincinnati is what I would like to know. Jamar Chase is as good as they come. You could have had him for $35 million a year last season. And here we are now. The number is at least 40. You yourself, your front office people are promising that top number and not delivering. What is the hang up? What are we doing here? And then the T. Higgins situation. I understand wanting your quarterback to be happy. This is one of those situations where, and T. Higgins, don't get me wrong, absolute stud. There are a ton of teams out there that he could be a number one for, whether he's been a number one or not, whether, going back to some of the comments I've made about my feelings of making T. Higgins a $30 million a year number one, despite not having to be the number one for the Bengals, basically his entire career, except for the first year he got there before Jamar Chase came in the following season. T. Higgins is now there, unhappy, franchise tagged. You're going to have to pay him a boatload of money as well. You're creating a rift in your locker room that's unnecessary. And again, I know Joe Burrow wants Higgins there, but at some point you got to look at Burrow and say, hey, we have to field a defense, and we want to keep Trey Hendrickson, who they're now allowing to look for a trade partner. They're asking for ludicrous compensation. I mean, a first-round pick is a lot on its own, but I don't necessarily think is super unreasonable, depending on the team. But they're asking for a first-round pick and then some right now, which I think is beyond unreasonable. You have to tell Burrow, we got to let this guy go. We're going to get compensation for him, and we're going to go get you another stud number 2 wide receiver. You can't just bend at the will of whatever your quarterback wants. I understand it would make Joe Burrow happy. It's not like he's going to go anywhere, though, if you just trade T. Higgins away and you look at him and go, listen, we're going to go draft you another guy. We're going to bring in another receiver to play number 2 alongside Jamar Chase. Like, you need to field an entire football team. And at some point, you have to be able to turn to your quarterback and go, you're making $50 million a year. Jamar Chase is about to make $40 million a year. And T. Higgins is on the book for damn near $30 million a year already on the franchise tag, let alone what he actually wants on a contract. You're going to have north of $120 million per year going to 3 guys on the offensive side of the football, which is approaching half the salary cap for 3 players on a 53-man roster. Is that conducive of a winning football team, if you ask me? No. There's just so much mishandling going on right now within Cincinnati, and I hate it because I enjoy watching the Bengals be good. It's one of those things that growing up, Cincinnati was not great. Carson Palmer, while he was there in the Chad Johnson days, that was a lot of fun to watch. But beyond that, not a ton out of Cincinnati. And when Joe Burrow came in and the defense was really good, Lou Anarumo was cooking with gas on that other side of the football while Joe Burrow was like a rising star and he was like a rocket attached to his back. It was fun to watch. I was riding and dying with the success of the Cincinnati Bengals. And here we are now. And this team's not going to have a defense to field next year because they're trying to pay 3 guys on offense north of $120 million a year. I don't know. At some point, your front office ownership does have to take control, and it feels like we're just watching it completely spiral. And you're going to have so much money locked up on just the offense alone, and you're going to have no real way of being able to play defense, and you're going to have to come to the grips with the fact that it's going to take 40 to 45 points a game if you want to win every single week. It's going to take that, all things considered, with just how little money you can allocate to the defensive side of the football. And I'm also a guy that, as much as I enjoy high-octane offense, am a firm believer defenses still win championships. I think we saw that in this past Super Bowl. I think we've seen that in plenty of Super Bowls. It happens far more frequently than the best offense in the NFL winning Super Bowls. I just don't know, man. It's frustrating. It really is. Again, I don't hate the Bengals. I cannot stress that enough, Bengals fans. I'm sure some of you are probably on that roller coaster right now, riding it the best you can. I'm there with you. I really am, because this is one of those things where I want the Bengals to be good. The AFC North is a tough division right now, and the better it is, the more fun it is for the NFL in my eyes. When the AFC North is this good, or is that good, where you have 3 teams competing and battling at minimum out of that division, it makes the NFL better in my eyes. There is something about AFC North football that the other 7 divisions in the NFL just don't quite have. And when Cincinnati was rocking and rolling, Steelers were competitive, Ravens were competitive, Browns were competitive. It makes the NFL just that much more entertaining to watch. Now, we'll end the show on a couple of positive notes. That's my last negative, end of my rant there. The next team we're going to look at here, we've got ourselves Jayden Daniels. Big winner in my eyes here. After an unbelievable rookie season, Jayden Daniels is being rewarded with some of his guys not only sticking around, but being given reinforcements as well on the offensive side of the football. The Commanders' trade for left tackle Laramie Tunsil is monumental. This is an offensive line that was not perfect last year, that in my eyes, Jayden Daniels did a really good job of covering up blemishes, and now you have one of the best blindside blockers in the NFL to really allow Jayden Daniels to, of course, keep using his legs where is necessary and where he sees fit, but he can really just drop back and pass the way we know he can. Deebo Samuel, trade for him. Whether you think he still has it or not, whether you think he's washed or not, that's not the conversation we're having here. Deebo Samuel is coming in as a complementary piece to an offense that was already amongst one of the best in the NFL last season. Deebo Samuel, Scary Terry, the running back room with Brian Robinson. This is a unit that I am really looking forward to watching in 2025 because, again, Deebo does not have to be the guy. He is just a complementary piece that continues to open up the playbook even further. Then, of course, you bring back a guy like Zach Ertz. This is one of the more underrated re-signings in my eyes. Zach Ertz is one of those guys that just quietly, especially on the back end of his career, has just continued to be a legit security blanket for whoever he's catching passes from. And again, the Zach Ertz is not someone you're going to write a headlining article about anywhere. Maybe not even in Washington, but this is a guy that when things get tough, when things get shaky, you know he's somewhere in the middle of that football field, and Jayden Daniels is going to be able to find him. Then you look at what they did on the defensive side of the football. Improvements, yeah, you had some swapping out going on. Jonathan Allen, he's allowed to walk in free agency, but you go in, what do? You bring in defensive tackle Javon Kinlaw. He's going to beef up the interior for you. Hopefully he can help fill that void. Bobby Wagner, in my eyes, culture setter, leader of not only that defense, but just this team as a whole. A been there, done that, won it all guy. A literal leader of one of the best defenses we've seen in the NFL in recent memory with that Legion of Boom over there in Seattle all those years ago. He's back to rack up another 100 or so tackles again for a 14th consecutive season, whatever the number is right now. I think he's either tied for the record or broke the record this year. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but no matter how old he is, the ageless Bobby Wagner, back in the middle of that defense. That's, again, another one of those things that at this stage in his career, maybe not nearly as quick as he was, not nearly at the level of athleticism he was, but he's got it up here, and he's able to lead what is a young, up-and-coming team, and helps lead a young and up-and-coming team all the way to an NFC Championship appearance last year. Then you got bringing key guys back. Again, this is all about just making the right moves, and this was the big thing that I liked about Washington's offseason so far. A guy like Noah Igbinoghene, brought back. Good season by him. Another one of those underrated guys, not allowing him to walk, keeping him there. This offseason, very different than last year. We saw basically an entire roster flipped through Washington last year. And when you have as much success as Washington had last year, basically just flipping the entire roster, I think it's easy to get lost in the fact of we had so much success. We picked all the right guys, it feels like. There were very few misses out of the free agency class for Washington last season. Like, very few, if any at all. It's very easy to come back in and go, oh, let's do it again. We hit on everybody last year. Who's to say we can't do it again? But no. Dial it back with the spending. You're very calculated with who you're bringing back. You only dished out one massive contract to Javon Kinlaw. Everybody else, it felt very calculated, decisive. This is a team that's building. They know they have their core nucleus. They just need a piece here, a piece there. What Washington is doing is so far ahead of schedule, but they're doing it in the right way, and they're not letting what was like an extreme amount of success in such a short amount of time cloud what the process needs to be. And this is one of those teams that a lot of people are going, well, they're probably going to take the inevitable step back next year, blah, 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 blah. Well, I don't know. Yeah, everyone's going to have tape on Daniels now. Sophomore slump is always something to keep an eye on. But the way I see it right now, with the state of the NFC East, other than Philadelphia, Washington, a really good favorite in my eyes to, at the very least, land that number 2 spot within that division. And them winning 10 games next year does not seem like a far-fetched idea to me. Even if people know they're coming, I said this about Houston last year, and granted, they basically, it was basically, they broke even essentially this year. After the first big season for CJ Stroud, you basically break even. Fine, so be it. But a lot of people were like, Houston's not going to do that again. Everyone's going to know, everyone's going to see it coming. Well, they basically got back to the playoffs. Similar situation happened, but they basically got back there. Everyone knew they were coming this time around. Same thing with Washington. In my eyes, at the worst, you're probably looking at a playoff appearance. Maybe you don't go as far into the playoffs. Maybe you go further. But with what they're doing right now, it feels like they've got their finger on the pulse of what needs to be done, and they're executing, and I love it. And then lastly, my final winner of free agency, this very early free agency thus far, we've got ourselves the Denver Broncos. I cannot gush enough about the Denver Broncos moves this free agency period. Another team that is being calculated with their moves, but they went ahead and they bulked up a defense that's already one of my favorite in the NFL and one of the best in the NFL in my eyes. Boasting 2 key additions. Talanoa Hufanga at safety, and then linebacker Dre Greenlaw. Now, Talanoa Hufanga just needs to stay healthy. All-Pro in 2022. When he's healthy and when he's on the field and not being hampered by injury, I consider him one of the top safeties. I'd at least put him in the top 10 in the NFL, at least. You could argue maybe even a little bit higher. You're going to pair him with a guy like Brandon Jones, who was a massive addition to this defense last year. And, of course, in tandem with a guy like Pat Surtain, who's working in that secondary as well. This could be one of the more formidable units in the NFL next season. You couple that with Dre Greenlaw, a guy who will now be about a year and some change, like a year and a half or so removed from that Achilles injury he suffered in the Super Bowl. I think last year was all about him just kind of finding his footing again. This next season, I think we're going to really see the reemergence of Dre Greenlaw, and pairing him up with Alex Singleton in the middle of that defense there is going to be a sight to behold. Nick Bonitto, quietly, because Denver surprised a lot of people last year, and I don't think a lot of people are aware of what's brewing over there, but Nick Bonitto, Jonathan Cooper on the edges there. You kept DJ Jones around in the interior of that defense. Zach Allen was huge for them last year. You've got one of the scariest defenses in the NFL brewing in Denver. Never mind what you're cooking on the offensive side of things. Way ahead of schedule on that side as well because of how well Bo Nix played last year. This is a team that will win, live and die by what their defense does next year in my eyes. But do not be shocked if we're looking at Denver as a top 3, top 2, or even the best defense in the NFL next year. Yes, high expectations, but I see what they're building over there, and I've always been a fan of Denver's defenses. I feel like ever since that 2015 Super Bowl 50, the last year that Manning was there, they've consistently had, if not championship caliber, they've had some pretty good defenses, and they're consistently good on that side of the ball. This feels like they're back to that championship level defense, and their nucleus of guys is so young and so talented, and they're only going to keep getting better here. Watch out for Denver, because if there is one defense that could drag a football team through a playoff run, I would pick Denver's defense to do so. But those are my winners. Those are my losers for free agency. Fire away in that comment section down below. I would love to hear from you all. Your thoughts, your opinions on my takes. What are your own takes? But as always, if you made it to the end, I greatly appreciate it. I will see you all next time. Have a good one.